Hi guys, so today we're going to go through the topic of cardiovascular drift for both OCR and the AQA specification. So for OCR, this is part of training in the heat topic, and then for AQA, it's just part of the cardiovascular system. And often in the mark schemes, you actually get a mark for acknowledging that cardiovascular drift is a side effect of exercising in the heat. So it's always worth mentioning that when you're experiencing cardiovascular drift, it's probably as a side effect of exercising in a really warm environment. And sometimes in the mark schemes, they also give you credit for acknowledging when it begins to happen. So it roughly starts to occur around 10 minutes into exercising in the heat. And the where it gets its name from is just that these two cardiovascular values are drifting apart from one another. So that's where the drift part of the name comes from. It's just that your heart rate and your stroke volume are drifting apart from one another. And they want you to explain why. So they firstly want you to explain, why does your stroke volume begin to plateau and decrease when you're exercising in the heat? And then why would that cause your heart rate then to increase? So let's start with why your stroke volume would decrease. And the reason for that is simply because when you're exercising in the heat, you're going to be sweating way more. And when you're sweating more, you're losing more water from the body. And part of where you're losing that water from is the blood plasma, so the liquid component of the blood. So let's say instead of your blood volume looking like this when you're hydrated, your blood volume might decrease when you're dehydrated. So when you're exercising in the heat and you're losing more water, part of where that water is going to be lost from is the blood plasma. So your blood plasma volume is going to go down. Now, there's several issues with that. And one of the main issues is that if you've got less blood plasma, if you've got less liquid in the blood, because remember, the blood plasma is the liquid component of the blood. If there's less blood plasma, we say that the blood viscosity increases. So viscosity means thickness. So if there's a higher viscosity, it means that the blood is very thick and it doesn't flow as well. So once you've mentioned that you're losing more water through sweating, you then say that that decreases your blood plasma volume, which increases your blood viscosity. So we've said that there's now less blood volume and it's thicker, so it's not flowing as well. And if that's the case, that's going to limit the amount of blood that can get back to the heart. And that's called venous return. So you'd then say, as a result of there being a lower blood volume, and the blood is thicker, it's not flowing as well, that will reduce your venous return. So let's say this is the heart here with the two atria and the two ventricles. If the blood viscosity is higher, there's going to be less venous return getting back to the heart. And then based on Starling's law, so Starling's law says that your stroke volume is dependent on your venous return. So how much blood is able to leave the heart is dependent on how much blood was coming back to the heart. So based on Starling's law, you'd say due to the decrease in venous return, that would then also lead to a decrease in stroke volume. So you've got to the point now where you've told the examiner why your stroke volume is decreasing when you're exercising in the heat. It's because you're losing more water through sweating. Therefore, your blood plasma volume is going down and your blood viscosity is increasing. The blood is more viscous. That means that it's more difficult for that blood to get back to the heart. So there's less venous return. And based on Starling's law, there is then a reduction in stroke volume. So they're the key terms that you'd want to throw in to explain why your stroke volume goes down. And then to explain why the heart rate then increases, it links back to the cardiac output equation. So cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. So if your stroke volume goes down, in order to try and maintain your cardiac output, your heart rate has to increase to compensate for that decrease in stroke volume. And that's what they want you to say. So they want you to say that your heart rate increases in order to compensate for that decrease in stroke volume in order to maintain your cardiac output. So your stroke volume goes down, ultimately because you're sweating more. But in order to keep the amount of blood leaving the heart per minute the same, your heart rate has to go up to compensate for that decrease in stroke volume. So that's why the heart rate ends up going up. And what that ultimately means is, as a result of cardiovascular drift, at any given intensity, when you're working or exercising in the heat, your heart rate is always going to be higher than it would be if you weren't exercising in the heat. So at any given intensity, your heart rate is always going to be higher in the heat than it would be otherwise. And that's actually the problem with cardiovascular drift. So what a lot of students think is, oh, it's because there's a decrease in stroke volume. That's the bad thing. But remember, although, yeah, there's less blood leaving the heart per beat, because the heart rate is increased to compensate for that, there's actually the same volume of blood leaving the heart per minute. So they don't actually want you to go down the route of cardiovascular drift is an issue because there'd be less oxygen getting to the muscles, because that actually wouldn't be the case initially, because you'd be able to maintain your cardiac output by your heart rate increasing. So there'd actually still be the same amount of oxygen getting to the muscles. So that's not the issue with cardiovascular drift. Instead, the sort of short-term issue with cardiovascular drift is actually to do with this high heart rate and how it's going to make you feel. So what they would want you to say, if they said, explain cardiovascular drift, it'd be this stuff. But if they said, and explain its impact on performance, they'd want you to reference why this high heart rate is an issue. And it comes down to something called your RPE. So your RPE stands for your rate of perceived exertion. And remember, your perception of something is your opinion on it. So your RPE is just how hard do you feel like you're working. And if your heart rate is higher, you feel like you're working harder than you are. So you might think back to like when you had to exercise in the summer versus the winter. You might be doing the exact same session, but it feels way harder in the summer. It's just because your heart rate is higher and you feel more exerted than you actually are. So let's say on this RPE scale, instead of feeling at a 5 or a 6, you might be feeling at a 9 or a 10 on the RPE scale when you're exercising in the heat. And that is the issue. It's more of a psychological issue rather than a physiological one. So they would want you to say that when you're exercising in the heat, due to the elevated heart rate, your RPE is higher and you feel more fatigued than you actually are. And therefore, you're just more likely to reduce your exercise intensity subconsciously. You're like, I feel really exerted here. I'm going to slow down. So that is the main issue with cardiovascular drift. It's that you feel like you're working harder than you actually are. So let's have a look at how they ask about this topic. So we'll start with a question from OCR. So very direct. It just says, explain what is meant by the term cardiovascular drift. So if we have a look at the mark scheme there, you get a mark for acknowledging that it is a side effect of exercising in the heat. You then get a mark for acknowledging that they put it in a bit of a weird order here, to be honest. I would personally start with that when you're exercising in the heat, you are sweating more, and therefore you have a reduction in your blood plasma volume because you're sweating more. That then, and again, I would expand on this even more. I'd say that increases your blood viscosity. It reduces venous return, which then reduces stroke volume based on Starling's law. And as a result of that decrease in stroke volume, in order to maintain your cardiac output, your heart rate has to increase to compensate for that. And that just means that your heart rate is higher at any given intensity in the heat compared to in cooler conditions. So you can see, based on the explanation we gave earlier, you'd be able to access all of those mark points there. So that's an OCR question. And then let's have a look at an AQA question. So they give you the graph here. So they show you that stroke volume's going down, heart rate's going up. And it says the graph above shows cardiovascular drift. Use the image to explain the term cardiovascular drift. So just be aware, whenever they say use the image, they definitely want you to use it. So for example here, look, they've given you time. So it happens roughly about 10 minutes into exercising, and then they'll probably credit in the heat here as well. But use the image So there should be a mark for this 10-minute point because it's wanting you to use the image. And then notice that cardiac output doesn't actually decrease. So they might give you a mark for saying that, like, that in order to maintain cardiac output, your heart rate increases. So let's have a look at the mark scheme there for question 22. So yeah, so there's a mark for stating that cardiovascular drift starts 10 minutes into exercise. So that was using the image. And it's where there is, again, it's a bit of a weird order, but I would start by saying you're losing more fluid through sweating. That reduces your blood plasma volume, which increases your blood viscosity. That reduces your venous return. And based on Starling's law, that leads to a decrease in stroke volume. And then as a result of that decrease in stroke volume, in order to maintain your cardiac output, your heart rate increases. And then they've actually put here cardiac output increases. I would argue that doesn't happen. I just sort of ignore that mark point, but you can see there, you definitely, using our explanation, you'd definitely be able to get full marks there for that AQA cardiovascular drift question as well. So I'd say for both exam boards, it's probably going to be a 3-4 marker if they do ask about it. So that is cardiovascular drift all done. So as always, if there's any other topics you'd like me to run through, drop them in the comments. And if you do want extra support with AQA or OCR A-level PE, feel free to click the link in the description and it will take you to my website.